The wind came for her like a predator. It howled through the Montana Valley, a raw, hungry sound that promised an ugly end. The snow wasn't falling. It was attacking, fired from the gray sky like a million tiny knives. 1878 was a bad year to be weak, and on this night the territory was culling the herd. Margaret Sullivan felt its teeth sink into her bones. Her shawl was a joke, a memory of warmth. Her dress, the blue calico Thomas had loved, was now just frozen rags clinging to her skin. She'd been walking for 2 days, or maybe 3. Time was a blur of white agony. Each step was a fresh scream from her feet, wrapped in the sad remains of her boots. The soles were gone. She was walking on frozen leather in prayer. The town had spit her out. Cedar Ridge. After Thomas died, they'd circled like buzzards. A logging accident, they said. A falling pine. The bank took the land, waving papers with debts she'd never seen. The store cut her off. The church ladies, the ones with sweet smiles and poisoned tongues, they crossed the street when they saw her coming. Widow Sullivan's got the devil's luck. She heard the whisper. Mrs. Patterson started it. First her parents, now her husband. The words followed her, colder than the wind. She collapsed at the base of a pine, the branches heavy with snow, offering nothing. She was done. Her fingers, numb and blue, found the small silver cross at her neck. The last thing Thomas had given her. The last thing they hadn't taken. Please, she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. Let it be swift. The prayer vanished in a puff of white. She thought of Thomas, his laugh, the calluses on his hands, the dreams they'd built, now buried under 6 feet of frozen dirt. The cold was turning warm now. She knew the sign, hypothermia's cruel kiss. A gentle way to go, they said. She closed her eyes, ready for the warmth, ready for the quiet, and then she heard it. Through the scream of the storm, a sound that didn't belong, the soft nicker of a horse. Samuel Hayes was tracking a ghost, a stray mare swallowed by the storm. He should have turned back hours ago. He knew the signs. This wasn't a storm, it was a reckoning. But the mare was his future, months of work and hope tied up in horseflesh. He pushed on, letting his stallion, Tempest, pick the way. The tracks led him deep into the pines far from his own land. He was about to give up, to admit defeat, when Tempest stopped dead. Ears pricked, nostrils flared. What is it, boy? Samuel squinted through the blinding white. He saw a shape, a snow-covered rock at the base of a tree, but Tempest snorted, pawing the ground. It wasn't a rock. Samuel dismounted, his boots sinking into the powder. As he got closer, his heart seized. It was a woman, curled up like a lost child, dressed in tatters. He thought he was too late, another frozen statue for the spring thaw. Then he heard the whisper, so faint it was almost part of the wind. Alive. He knelt, turning her face to his. Her lips were blue. Frost glittered on her eyelashes like tiny, cruel diamonds. Her eyes fluttered open, gray and empty as the sky. Ma'am? His voice was rough. Can you hear me? Her lips moved, forming a word with no sound. Samuel didn't wait. He knew death's timetable. He shrugged off his heavy coat, wrapping it around her fragile body. He lifted her. She weighed nothing, as if the wilderness had already eaten its fill, leaving just the stubborn flicker of a soul. No, please, she breathed. Let me be. Not happening, Samuel said, his voice a low growl. He carried her to Tempest, somehow managing to mount with her in his arms, settling her in front of him. You're not dying on my land, not tonight. The ride back was a fight for every foot. He held her tight, trying to force his own warmth into her. She drifted, muttering words he couldn't catch. Then one came through, clear as a bell. Thomas! The hope in that single word twisted something in his gut. His cabin appeared like a ghost in the storm. A single room of hewn logs, smoke curling from the chimney. He'd banked the fire, a habit that was about to save a life. Inside, he laid her on his bed. His only bed. He stoked the fire until it roared, chasing the killing cold back into the corners. Only then did he truly see her. The hunger in her hollow cheeks, the bruises of a long defeat. But beneath the grime and the sorrow, there was a ghost of beauty, a delicacy that didn't belong in this hard country. He heated water. He found clean blankets. He faced the dilemma. Her wet clothes were a death sentence. Propriety be damned. He worked fast, his movements impersonal, wrapping her in layer after layer of warm wool, hanging her ruined dress by the fire. He pulled his chair to the bed and began the vigil. Hours passed. Color seeped back into her skin. Her breathing deepened. And as he watched her, a question burned in his mind. What had happened in Cedar Ridge to drive a woman into the heart of a killer storm? The frontier was full of broken dreams. He knew that better than most. The wind howled, but inside, two souls were sheltered from the storm. Her eyes snapped open, not glazed this time, clear and filled with terror. The instinctive fear of a woman waking up in a strange man's cabin, helpless. He held up his hands, his voice low and calm, the way he'd soothe a spooked horse. "You're safe," he said. "Storm caught you. My name's Samuel Hayes. You're in my cabin." He saw her eyes flick down to the small silver cross resting against the rough wool of his blanket. A flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition. His voice was calm, but his heart was pounding. He knew that cross. He'd seen it before, and the man who wore it was supposed to be dead. Margaret studied the stranger, Samuel Hayes. His face was weathered, carved by wind and sun, but his eyes were steady. He held a careful distance, even as he offered her life. She saw his gaze linger on the silver cross at her throat, and a strange tension filled the small cabin. "I know that cross," he said, his voice flat, all the previous warmth gone. "Where did you get it?" The question was sharp, an accusation. Margaret's hand flew to her throat, her fingers closing around the familiar shape. "It was my husband's," she whispered, her voice still weak. "Thomas, it was a wedding gift." Samuel's expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. He stood up, turning his back to her, and stared into the roaring fire. "Thomas Sullivan," he said, not a question, a statement. "He worked the logging camps." "Yeah," Margaret said, confused by the sudden chill. "You knew him." "I knew of him," Samuel said. The words clipped. The air crackled with unspoken history. He had saved her life. But in that moment, she felt a new kind of danger, a deep and unsettling mystery that clung to him like the scent of wood smoke. This man was no simple Samaritan. He was a part of her past, a past she thought was buried with her husband. She woke again hours later to the smell of coffee and bacon. The storm had quieted to a low moan. Samuel sat at the small table, his back to her, cleaning a rifle. The scene was peaceful, but the tension from before remained, a ghost in the room. She sat up, the blankets pooled around her. "I should go," she said, the words feeling foolish as soon as they left her mouth. "Go where? Back into the snow?" "You're not going anywhere," he said without turning around. "Not until the storm breaks, and not until you tell me everything." He finally turned to face her, his eyes hard. "Tell me about Cedar Ridge. Tell me what happened to Thomas." The kindness from the night before was gone, replaced by a grim intensity. He wasn't offering shelter anymore. He was demanding answers. And Margaret, weak and alone, had no choice but to give them. She told him everything. The logging accident, the sudden debts, the bank seizing their small plot of land, the whispers, the cruelty, the way an entire town had turned on her overnight, treating her like a disease. She spoke of Mrs. Patterson's whispers, of the store owner Morrison refusing her credit, of Jake Watson's leering advances. As she spoke, she watched his face. The hardness didn't soften, but it changed. A muscle worked in his jaw. He wasn't just listening, he was dissecting every word, fitting pieces together in a puzzle she didn't even know existed. When she finished, a heavy silence fell. "They said it was a falling pine," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Crushed him instantly." "That's what the foreman told me," Margaret said, her own voice trembling as she recalled the worst day of her life. A tragic accident. "There are no accidents at a logging camp, Mrs. Sullivan," Samuel said, his eyes boring into hers. "Only mistakes. Or murder." The word hung in the air, sharp and deadly as an axe blade. Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs. Murder? It was an insane thought. Who would want to murder Thomas? He was a good man, well liked. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone? "That's what I intend to find out," Samuel said. He stood and walked to the small window, peering out at the endless white. Your husband wasn't just a logger. He was looking for something. Something on that land the bank was so quick to steal. A new terrifying reality began to dawn on Margaret. The town's cruelty hadn't been random. It had been calculated. They hadn't just abandoned her. They had been pushing her out, trying to bury a secret along with her husband. What was he looking for? She whispered. Samuel turned from the window, his face grim. He picked up the silver cross from where it lay on the bedside table. He ran his thumb over the intricate design, his touch almost reverent. This wasn't just a wedding gift, was it? It's older than that. Much older. Margaret shook her head, confused. It was his grandfather's. It was all he had of his family. My family, too, Samuel said quietly. The world tilted on its axis. Margaret could only stare, her mind struggling to connect the impossible dots. The Sullivans in the Haze, he explained, his voice laced with an old sorrow. Our grandfathers were partners, prospectors. They came to this valley together, looking for gold. They found something, all right. Something they recorded on a map. They split the map in two, each taking half. One half was engraved on the back of a silver locket. The other, he held up the cross, was hidden in here. He worked a small, almost invisible seam at the base of the cross. It sprang open, revealing a tiny, tightly rolled piece of parchment. It was a map, half a map. My sister Sarah wore the locket, he said, his voice thick with grief. It was buried with her. So the map was lost, forever. Margaret's flicker of hope died. No, Samuel said, seeing the look on her face. My father was a cautious man. He made a copy. I have it. I've spent the last 6 years searching for this cross, for the other half of the map. He looked at her, and for the first time, she understood the fire in his eyes. It wasn't just grief for his family. It was a burning, all-consuming obsession. He hadn't saved her out of kindness. He had saved her because she was the key. Thomas must have figured it out, Samuel continued, his voice low and intense. He must have known what was on his land, and someone in Cedar Ridge found out he knew. So they killed him and created those fake debts to steal the land before he could file a claim. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Her entire life, her love, her loss, it was all a lie, a cover for greed and murder. The town hadn't just cast her out. They had tried to erase her, and now she was sitting in a cabin with a man whose own quest for vengeance was inextricably tangled with hers. He needed her, and she, God help her, needed him. The rancher had given her his bed to rest, but he hadn't given her a sanctuary. He had given her a battlefield. A fragile truce settled over the cabin. Samuel was no longer just her rescuer. He was an ally, bound to her by a shared history she was only beginning to understand. He gave her a faded wool dress that had belonged to his mother. It was years out of fashion, but clean and whole. As she mended its seams to fit her own thin frame, she watched him. He moved with a quiet, dangerous grace, a man accustomed to solitude and secrets. He told her about his family, the scarlet fever that swept through the valley 6 years ago, taking his parents, his sister Sarah, and her 2 small children while he was away on a cattle drive. He'd come back to empty houses and fresh graves. Folks started avoiding me, he said, staring into the fire, his face a mask of old pain, like death was a shadow I carried with me. Margaret understood that kind of isolation. She'd felt it herself. But Samuel's story felt incomplete. There was a darkness in his eyes that went beyond grief, a guilt. She didn't press. She had her own ghosts. Instead, she focused on the present, on survival. I can work, she insisted. I won't be a burden. When he agreed, and a routine formed. She cooked and cleaned, turning his sparse cabin into something resembling a home. He tended his horses and chopped wood, his presence a solid wall against the howling storm outside. But beneath the surface of their quiet domesticity, the murder of her husband and the secret of the map pulsed like a hidden wound. One evening, as she was washing the supper dishes, he laid the 2 map fragments on the table. His own, a worn piece of paper, and the tiny parchment from the cross. Side by side, they formed a complete picture of the valley, of the creek that ran through her land. her former land, and a small, crudely drawn X marked on a specific bend in the creek. "Gold?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "More than gold," Samuel said. "Our grandfathers weren't just looking for color in the pan. They were geologists of a sort. They believed this valley was the source, a mother lode, enough to make a man a king or get him killed." He pointed to a notation on the map written in faint, spidery script. "The Devil's Maw," he read. "That's what they called the spot. There's a cave system there, hidden behind a waterfall." A memory sparked in Margaret's mind. Thomas coming home late one evening, soaked to the bone, but with a strange, excited light in his eyes. He'd been exploring, he'd said, found a series of caves near the creek. He'd been about to tell her more when a neighbor had stopped by, and the moment was lost. The next day, he was dead. "He found it," she breathed. "Thomas found the cave." "And he told someone," Samuel added, his voice grim. "He must have. Someone he trusted." Margaret's mind reeled. Who could it have been? Thomas was friendly with everyone. He'd stop and talk to anyone in town. Morrison at the store, the banker, Mr. Gable, even Mrs. Patterson's husband, who ran the lumber mill. The very men who had picked his life apart after he died. They weren't just vultures. They were wolves in sheep's clothing. "We have to get back there," Margaret said, a new fire in her voice. "We have to prove what they did." "We will," Samuel promised, "when the storm breaks. But we'll be walking into a snake pit. They won't just let us walk onto that land and start digging. They killed your husband to get it. They won't hesitate to kill us." For the first time in months, Margaret didn't feel like a victim. She felt a cold, hard rage solidifying in her gut. They had taken everything from her, her husband, her home, her future. She would not let them take the truth too. That night, she lay awake in the small storage room Samuel had cleared for her. She listened to the sound of his steady breathing from the main room, separated by a thin wall of wood. He was a stranger, a man driven by a decades-old quest. His motives weren't entirely pure. He wanted the gold as much as he wanted justice. But their paths had merged. Their enemies were the same. She was no longer just the widow Sullivan, adrift and alone. She was Margaret Hayes, a partner in a dangerous game of vengeance. She pressed her hand against the rough wall as if she could feel his presence through the wood. On the other side, Samuel lay awake, staring into the darkness. He had searched for this woman, or rather the cross she carried, for 6 long years. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, but he'd never imagined her. He'd never imagined the quiet strength in her gray eyes or the way his lonely cabin suddenly felt like a home with her in it. He told himself it was about the map, about justice for his family, but as he listened to her soft breathing, he knew it was becoming about something more, and that terrified him more than any killer hiding in Cedar Ridge. The rancher had given her his bed to rest, but what they had found together was a reason to fight, and a reason to fear. The storm finally broke after 2 weeks of relentless fury. It left behind a world of blinding white and deadly silence. The snow was piled in massive drifts, some as high as the cabin's roof. It was beautiful, and it was a prison. "It'll be days before we can even think of traveling to Cedar Ridge," Samuel said, leaning on a shovel after hours of trying to clear a path to the barn. The work was brutal. The cold was still sharp enough to steal the breath from your lungs. Margaret worked alongside him, her own slight frame wiry and tough. The starvation and grief that had nearly killed her had also stripped her down to a core of pure steel. In the evenings, they huddled by the fire, planning. They studied the map until they knew every line and symbol by heart. They talked about the men in Cedar Ridge, trying to figure out who was the weak link, who was the ringleader. Gable, the banker, had the most to gain financially, Margaret reasoned. He drew up the false debt papers. But Morrison at the store controls the town's supplies, its credit, Samuel countered. He knows everyone's business. He's the spider in the center of the web. "And what about Watson?" Margaret shuddered. "He's just a thug, a tool." "The most dangerous tools are the ones that don't think," Samuel said grimly. "He's the one we have to watch out for. He's unpredictable." As the days turned into a week, their forced proximity began to change the dynamic between them. The careful distance they'd maintained started to shrink. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, a partnership born of shared purpose and isolation. She learned the nuances of his moods, the way a muscle in his jaw would tick when he was angry, the rare, surprising warmth of his smile. He in turn saw past the grieving widow to the intelligent, resilient woman beneath. He found himself watching her, the efficient way she moved about the cabin, the fierce concentration on her face when she mended his clothes, the sadness that still shadowed her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. One night, the conversation shifted from the map to the past. "Tell me about her," Margaret said softly. "Sarah." Samuel was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "She was light," he finally said, his voice rough. "She saw the good in everyone, even when it wasn't there. She loved this valley, said it was the closest she'd ever get to heaven." He paused, his throat working. "The fever came fast. I was gone. By the time I got the news and rode back, it was over. They were all gone. I never even got to say goodbye." His confession was raw, a wound ripped open. "But there's something you're not telling me," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. She saw the guilt that always flickered in the depths of his eyes. "It wasn't just the fever, was it?" Samuel flinched as if she'd struck him. He stood abruptly and paced the small cabin like a caged animal. "We had an argument," he bit out, the words torn from him. "Before I left on that cattle drive. She was in love with a man from town, a gambler, a no-good drifter. I forbade her from seeing him. I told her he was after the locket, after the secret of the map. We said terrible things to each other." He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. "The last words I ever said to my sister were angry ones. When the fever came, the man she loved, he fled, left her to die alone. So maybe I was right about him. But I was wrong too. I drove her away. And then she was gone." He finally turned to face her, his face etched with years of self-recrimination. "So you see, I'm not some hero, Margaret. I'm a man who failed his family. This isn't just about justice. It's about atonement." The confession changed everything. He wasn't a cold, obsessed stranger anymore. He was a man drowning in grief, just like her. Her heart ached for him. Without thinking, she crossed the space between them and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid with tension. "You can't blame yourself, Samuel," she said softly. "You were trying to protect her." "And I failed," he whispered, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. The air grew thick, charged with all the unspoken emotions that had been building between them for weeks. He was so close. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the scent of pine and leather that clung to him. His hand came up, his calloused fingers gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth in the cold, lonely landscape of her life. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers, asking a question she was too afraid to answer. The moment stretched, fragile and terrifying. This was not part of the plan. Her alliance with him was supposed to be about vengeance, about reclaiming her life. Not this, not a new feeling, a dangerous spark that threatened to burn down the careful walls she had built around her heart. She pulled back, the spell broken. "It's late," she stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We have an early morning." She fled to the safety of her small room, her mind in turmoil. The fight for the gold, for justice, was straightforward. But this new, unexpected war within her own heart was a territory she didn't know how to navigate. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. Now she feared he was about to capture her soul. The journey to Cedar Ridge was a descent into hell. The melted snow had turned the valley into a treacherous mire of mud and ice. It took them 2 days of hard travel, the silence in the wagon thick with the unspoken tension from that night in the cabin. Samuel was polite, but distant. Margaret was wrapped in her own confusion. She mourned Thomas. She did. But the feelings Samuel awoke in her were a different thing entirely, a terrifying, exhilarating current of life in a heart she thought had died. Cedar Ridge looked the same. Smoke curled from chimneys. The false front of Morrison's general store gleamed in the weak winter sun. But Margaret saw it with new eyes now. She didn't see a community. She saw a conspiracy. Their arrival was a spectacle. Faces appeared in windows. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Mrs. Henderson, sweeping her porch, froze like a statue, her mouth a perfect O of shock. Samuel helped Margaret down from the wagon, his hand firm on her elbow. "Stay close," he murmured. "Don't let them separate us." The bell on the door of Morrison's store jangled, announcing their entrance into the spider's web. James Morrison was behind the counter. His face was a quick cascade of emotions: surprise, then fear, then a mask of oily welcome. "Hayes," he said, his eyes flicking to Margaret. "Mrs. Sullivan, we all thought you were gone." "Sorry to disappoint you," Margaret said, her voice colder than the wind outside. Samuel stepped forward, his presence filling the small store. "We need supplies, Morrison, and some answers." Just then the bell jangled again. Mrs. Patterson bustled in, her face a mask of pious concern that curdled into ugly speculation as she saw Margaret standing beside Samuel. "Mercy!" she gasped, clutching at her chest. "Margaret Sullivan, alive, and, well." Her eyes raked over Margaret's clean dress, the healthy color in her cheeks. "I see you found shelter." The insinuation was as sharp as a slap. "Mrs. Sullivan is assisting me at my ranch," Samuel said, his voice a low warning, "in exchange for her protection." "Protection?" a slurred voice cut in. Jake Watson lurched through the door, his eyes bloodshot, stinking of whiskey. He swaggered towards Margaret, a greasy smile on his face. "That what you're calling it, Hayes?" I made the little widow a similar offer, but she wasn't so agreeable. He reached out a grimy hand to touch her arm. Samuel moved like a flash of lightning. One moment Watson was leering at Margaret, the next he was slammed against a barrel of pickles, the breath knocked out of him in a wheezing gasp. Samuel's face was a thundercloud of rage. "You will address her as Mrs. Hayes," he snarled. The words shocked the entire store into silence, including Margaret. "Mrs. Hayes? We were married by the circuit preacher last week," Samuel lied, his voice ringing with authority. He hadn't consulted her. He'd just declared it. It was a strategic move, a shield to protect her reputation. But it felt like a cage snapping shut around her heart. "Now," Samuel continued, turning his cold gaze on Morrison, "my wife and I have come to reclaim her property, the land that was stolen from her." Morrison began to sweat. "Now, Hayes, there were debts. It was all legal. The bank, the store, the mill." Samuel cut him off. "It's a neat little circle, isn't it? You all scratch each other's backs." "This is an outrage," Mrs. Patterson shrieked. "This woman is a disgrace, and you, Samuel Hayes, have lost your mind." "No," a new voice said from the doorway. Old man Hemlock, a trapper who lived in the hills and rarely came to town, stood there, his rifle cradled in his arms. "I think he's just found it." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor. "I was up on the ridge the day Sullivan died. I heard them arguing. Two men. Didn't see their faces, but I heard their voices. It wasn't no accident." The store was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Hemlock's words were a bomb thrown into their web of lies. Morrison's face went pale. Mrs. Patterson looked like she was about to faint. "You're a crazy old coot," Watson gasped, clutching his bruised ribs. "No one will believe you." "They'll believe this," Samuel said. He unrolled the map on the counter. "They'll believe the territorial marshal when he comes to investigate a claim of murder and fraud." The bluff was audacious. There was no marshal, not yet, but the threat was enough. The conspirators exchanged panicked glances. Their neat little secret was unraveling. Samuel grabbed the supplies they needed, threw a coin on the counter, and took Margaret's arm. "This isn't over," he said to the silent, staring faces. As they walked out into the cold street, Margaret's mind was spinning. Mrs. Hayes. He had bound them together, not just with a shared purpose, but with a public lie. It was a brilliant, ruthless move. But as they climbed back into the wagon, she realized the truth. They weren't just partners in vengeance anymore. In the eyes of the world, and perhaps in the deepest corners of her own confused heart, they were something more. The rancher had given her his bed to rest, and now he had given her his name, a name that could get them both killed. Mrs. Hayes? Margaret's voice was a furious whisper as the wagon rattled out of Cedar Ridge. You had no right. I had every right, Samuel countered, his eyes fixed on the muddy road ahead. It was the only way to shut them up, to give you a shield. Unmarried, you're a victim they can slander. Married, you're a wife they have to respect. It's the way of the world. It was a lie. It was a weapon, he shot back. And we need every weapon we can get. They're scared now. That old trapper's testimony, the map. They know we're on to them. They're not just going to sit back and wait for a marshal that isn't coming. He was right, of course. The cold logic of it was undeniable. But her heart was in turmoil. The lie felt too much like a truth she wasn't ready to face. They made camp in a sheltered cove as dusk fell. The fire crackled, a small bubble of warmth against the vast, cold wilderness. Samuel was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and economical. Margaret watched him, the way the firelight played across the hard plains of his face. He was a man forged by this unforgiving land, tough, pragmatic, and dangerous. Thank you, she said suddenly. He looked up, surprised. For what you did back there, for standing up for me. A flicker of warmth softened his expression. They've underestimated you from the beginning, Margaret. I haven't. He paused, then laid the rifle aside. About what I said, about us being married. It was for protection, but he hesitated and she saw a vulnerability in him that she'd never seen before. It wasn't just a lie to me, Margaret. I know this is all happening too fast. I know you're still grieving, but when I'm with you, the ghosts get quieter. The cabin feels like a home. I haven't felt that in 6 years. His confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than a touch. He was offering her not just his protection, not just his name, but his scarred and broken heart. What could she offer him in return? She was a woman whose own heart was a battlefield of ghosts and new, terrifying feelings. Before she could answer, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. Instantly, Samuel was on his feet, rifle in hand, his body shielding hers. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a low growl. Silence. The fire hissed and popped. The woods were unnaturally quiet. Then a voice floated out of the darkness. "Easy there, Hayes. Just wanted to talk." Out of the trees stepped Old Man Hemlock, the trapper from the store. He kept his hands in plain sight, away from the rifle slung over his shoulder. "What do you want?" Samuel asked, not lowering his weapon. "To tell you what I really saw," Hemlock said, his eyes flicking from Samuel to Margaret. "I didn't just hear voices that day. I saw a man, just for a second, running from the logging site right after the tree fell. It was Jake Watson." The name dropped like a stone in the quiet clearing. Watson, the drunken thug. It didn't make sense. He wasn't smart enough to plan a murder and a complex financial fraud. He was just the muscle, Samuel said, voicing Margaret's thoughts. Someone else was the brain, Morrison or Gable. "That's not all," Hemlock said, stepping closer to the fire. "They're not going to let you get off this mountain alive. Morrison sent a rider out of town right after you left, headed north. There's a gang of outlaws wintering up in the high passes, hired guns. They'll be coming for you." The threat was no longer a matter of whispers and legal papers. It was coming for them with guns and bullets. They were trapped. Cedar Ridge was behind them, a nest of snakes. Their cabin was ahead, a lonely, isolated target. And somewhere in the wilderness between, a gang of killers was on their trail. "Why are you helping us?" Margaret asked, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Hemlock looked at her, his old eyes surprisingly clear in the firelight. "Because Thomas Sullivan was a decent man. He shared his coffee with me once on the trail, treated me like a human being. Not many folks do. And because I'm sick of Morrison and his cronies choking the life out of this valley, it's time someone stood up to them." He turned to leave. "You've got maybe a day's lead. They'll come for you at the ranch. It's the only place you can make a stand. Watch your backs." And then he melted back into the trees, leaving them alone with the fire and the terrible new knowledge. They broke camp before dawn. The tension was a living thing now, a third passenger in the wagon. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. They didn't talk. There was nothing left to say. The plan was simple and desperate. Get back to the cabin, fortify it, and prepare for a siege. As they traveled, Margaret found herself thinking about Samuel's unfinished confession by the fire. He had offered her his heart, and she had been too afraid to respond. Now they might not live long enough for her to find the answer. The fear of dying was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But the fear of dying before she had a chance to truly live again, to explore the feelings this man stirred in her, was a far greater agony. They reached the ranch late that afternoon. The small cabin, which had once seemed a perfect refuge, now looked fragile and exposed. "We'll board up the windows," Samuel said, his voice all business. "Reinforce the door. We have enough food and ammunition to hold out for a few days." As they worked, a frantic energy passing between them, Margaret knew a decision had been made in the silent chambers of her heart. She wasn't the broken widow from the snowstorm anymore. She was a fighter. She was a survivor. And she was Mrs. Hayes. "Samuel," she said, stopping him as he carried a heavy plank of wood. He turned, his face grim. "When this is over," she said, her voice clear and strong, "ask me again. Properly." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his weary features. It was a promise, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness. They would live through this. They had to. That night, as they sat in the darkened, fortified cabin, taking turns on watch, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace. The world outside was full of men who wanted them dead. But inside she was with the one man she trusted, the one man who had seen her at her weakest and believed in her strength. The fight of their lives was coming. But for the first time, Margaret Sullivan Hayes was not afraid. The rancher had given her his bed to rest, his name to protect her, and his heart to cherish. In return, she would give him the one thing she had left, a willingness to fight by his side until the bitter end. The waiting was a special kind of torture. Every hour that passed stretched their nerves thinner. They worked in near silence, cleaning weapons, stacking ammunition, and watching. The beautiful, silent valley had become a hunting ground, and they were the prey. During the long, quiet hours of the second night, Samuel turned to her. "Margaret," he said, his voice low in the darkness, "there's something else about my family, something I didn't tell you." He took a deep breath. "The fever. It took most of them, but it wasn't what killed my father." Margaret waited, her heart starting to pound. After he found them, after he buried them, he was half mad with grief. He took the map, his gun, and went into the hills, swearing he'd find the locket and the cross and get the gold that should have been theirs. He was obsessed, said the valley owed him. He paused, the memory clearly painful. He never came back. The official story is that he got caught in an early blizzard, froze to death. But I found his body the next spring. He'd been shot. It was Morrison and Gable, I'm sure of it. They'd been trying to buy our land for years. I think they followed him, killed him, and took his half of the map. They just never found the locket. That's why I've been looking for the cross all these years. It's not just about atonement for Sarah. It's about vengeance for my father." The revelation was staggering. This wasn't just about Thomas. It was a feud that stretched back years, a story of greed and murder that had claimed both their families. They weren't just fighting for a gold claim. They were fighting to end a cycle of violence that had haunted the valley for a generation. The attack came at dawn. They appeared at the edge of the tree line, 5 of them, dark figures against the rising sun. They weren't the disorganized thugs Margaret had imagined. They moved with a chilling efficiency, spreading out, using the terrain for cover. This was more than a simple posse. These were professional killers. The first bullet splintered the wood of the windowsill, showering Margaret's face with splinters. She didn't flinch. She raised her own rifle, sighted down the barrel as Samuel had taught her, and fired. The fight was a blur of noise and smoke and fear. They were horribly outnumbered. For every shot they fired, 5 came back in return. The cabin, their sanctuary, was being torn apart around them, wood splintering, glass shattering. Samuel was a force of nature. Moving from window to window, his shots measured and deadly. He fought with a cold, contained fury, the rage of a man with nothing left to lose. But there were too many. They were being pinned down, a relentless hail of lead keeping them from getting a clear shot. One of the outlaws made a run for the barn, hoping to set it ablaze and smoke them out. Samuel aimed, fired, and the man dropped. But in that moment, another attacker appeared at the side window, a place they hadn't been watching. He leveled his pistol at Samuel's exposed back. "Samuel, look out!" Margaret screamed. She didn't have time to aim. She just fired her rifle from the hip. The blast was deafening in the small cabin. The man at the window staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of shock and pain. She had hit him. She had shot a man. There was no time to process it. The others were pressing their attack, emboldened. "We can't hold them," Samuel yelled over the gunfire. "They'll burn us out or wait until we're out of ammunition." His face was grim. He was looking for an escape, a desperate last-ditch plan. But there was nowhere to run. Just as despair began to set in, a new sound split the air. A volley of rifle fire, coming not from the cabin, but from the ridge behind the attackers. The outlaws whirled around confused, caught in a crossfire. Figures were emerging from the woods. Old Man Hemlock, and behind him Tom Johnson and the Miller brothers, neighbors who had been wary of Samuel and Margaret, but who clearly drew the line at hired killers invading their valley. Hemlock had ridden for help. The tide had turned. The professional killers, now facing an armed and furious group of ranchers, lost their nerve. Two of them fell. The other two, including the man Margaret had wounded, scrambled for their horses and fled into the wilderness. The silence that fell after the last hoofbeats faded away was more profound than the gunfire had been. It was the sound of survival. Samuel pulled Margaret into his arms, his body trembling with adrenaline. "You saved my life," he breathed into her hair. "We saved each other," she replied, her voice shaky. Outside, their neighbors approached, their faces a mixture of relief and respect. Tom Johnson clapped Samuel on the shoulder. "Looks like you had some trouble, Hayes." "Nothing we couldn't handle," Samuel said, a grin touching his lips for the first time in days. Old Man Hemlock spat a stream of tobacco. "Figured you could use a hand. Morrison's gotten too big for his britches." It was a turning point. They weren't outcasts anymore. They were part of the community, bound together by a shared fight against a common enemy. But the real fight was still ahead. The men who had hired the killers were still sitting in Cedar Ridge, thinking they were safe. "It's time to end this," Samuel said, his eyes meeting Margaret's over the heads of their newfound allies. They would ride into town not as victims or outcasts, but as the leaders of a rebellion. They would take back their land, expose a conspiracy, and get justice for a generation of murder. The showdown in Cedar Ridge was coming, and this time, they wouldn't be alone. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. The community had given them their strength, and together they would give their enemies a reckoning. They rode into Cedar Ridge, not as a couple, but as an army. Samuel and Margaret led the way, with a dozen armed and grim-faced ranchers riding behind them. The townspeople, sensing the shift in the wind, scattered before them. Doors slammed, windows were shuttered. The town that had judged them now feared them. Their first stop was the bank. They found Mr. Gable frantically trying to burn papers in his office stove. Tom Johnson and the Miller brothers took care of him, recovering the half-burned documents that detailed the fraudulent loans and land seizures, not just of Margaret's property, but of a half-dozen other small ranches over the years. Their next stop was the general store. Morrison tried to bluff, puffing out his chest and demanding to know the meaning of this outrage. Samuel just laid the scorched ledger from the bank on the counter. Morrison's face collapsed like a wet paper bag, but the real confrontation was waiting for them at the lumber mill. They found Mrs. Patterson there, screeching at her husband, who was throwing supplies into a wagon, clearly planning to flee. Jake Watson was with them, his arm in a sling from Margaret's bullet. "It's over," Samuel said, his voice echoing in the vast open mill. Watson went for his gun. He never cleared the holster. Samuel's draw was a blur of motion. The shot was deafening. Watson crumpled to the ground. His reign of terror ended in a cloud of sawdust. Mrs. Patterson screamed, a long, ugly sound of pure hatred. "You've ruined us," she shrieked at Margaret. "You and your devil's luck." "It wasn't luck," Margaret said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. "It was greed. Your greed. You killed my husband. You tried to kill me. all for a whisper of gold. It was then that Mr. Patterson broke. The milquetoast man, who had lived in his wife's shadow for years, finally found his voice. "I told you," he wept, turning on his wife. "I told you we should have left it alone. But you wouldn't listen. You always wanted more." In a torrent of sobs and confessions, the whole ugly story came out. How Mrs. Patterson had overheard Thomas talking to her husband about the caves. How she had pushed her husband and the others to act. How they had paid Watson to arrange the accident. It was all for nothing. They had the land, but they had never found the entrance to the Devil's Maw. The justice of the frontier was swift. Gable, Morrison, and the Pattersons were locked in the town's small jail to await the real territorial marshal who had been summoned by one of the ranchers. The cloud of fear that had hung over Cedar Ridge for years had finally been lifted. As the sun began to set, Samuel and Margaret stood on the porch of what had once been her home. The deed recovered from the bank was in Samuel's hand. He held it out to her. "It's yours, Margaret. It was always yours." She took the paper, but then she reached out and took his hand. "It's ours," she said softly. They walked the land together, to the bend in the creek, to the hidden waterfall. Behind it, just as the map promised, was the dark entrance to a cave, the Devil's Maw. They stood before it, the goal of a lifetime of searching, the cause of so much death and sorrow. "Are we going in?" Margaret asked. Samuel looked from the cave entrance to her face, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He thought of his father's obsession, of the years he had wasted on vengeance. He thought of the empty cabin and the lonely life he had led. And he thought of the woman who had stumbled out of a snowstorm and brought life back into his world. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. "The greatest treasure in this valley isn't in some dark cave, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's standing right here in front of me." He let the two halves of the map, the key to a fortune, flutter from his fingers and drift away on the creek. The past was done. Their future was about to begin. He knelt then, right there on the muddy bank of the creek, and took her hand. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his eyes shining, "you are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. I lied about you being my wife to protect you, but I've never wanted anything to be more true. Will you marry me? Properly this time?" Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy and relief, and a love so powerful it stole her breath away. "Yes, Samuel Hayes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Summer arrived, and with it a wedding. The whole valley attended. The church was filled with flowers and laughter. Margaret, in a dress she'd sewn herself, with lace sent all the way from St. Louis by a grateful Mrs. Johnson, finally and truly became Mrs. Hayes. They rebuilt their life together, not on the ashes of the past, but on the solid foundation of their love. They expanded the ranch, their hard work turning it into one of the most prosperous in the valley. The gold in the Devil's Maw remained untouched, a local legend whispered around campfires. Their wealth was in their land, their cattle, and their growing family. A year after the showdown, the sound of a baby's cry echoed in the small cabin. A boy, with his mother's gray eyes and his father's stubborn chin. They named him Thomas. The next year, a daughter was born, a girl with a shock of dark hair and a laugh that reminded Samuel so much of his sister, they had to name her Sarah. The ghosts were finally quiet. The cabin was filled with life. The valley, once a place of sorrow and secrets, was now a place of community and hope. One evening, years later, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch of the fine new house they had built, watching their children play in the yard. The setting sun painted the mountains in hues of purple and gold. Samuel reached for his wife's hand, his touch as familiar and comforting as his own heartbeat. "No regrets?" he asked, the old question now a gentle ritual. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full. "Only that it took a blizzard to bring you to me," she said. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. She had given him a reason to live. And together in the heart of the wild Montana frontier, they had found what the gold prospectors had searched for in vain, a treasure beyond all measure, a love story for the ages. Thank you so much for listening to this tale of love and justice on the frontier. If you enjoyed Margaret and Samuel's journey, I know you'll love the other stories we have waiting for you. Do you believe in love finding a way, even in the harshest conditions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I truly love reading them. And if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell so you never miss another story from the heart of the Wild West. Your support helps us keep these timeless tales alive. Until next time, stay safe and keep the campfire burning.